Young man, what are you doing here?
I'm moving into my new apartment.
Y'all right, your hands behind your back.
Why are you arresting me? I have my ID.
Cop arrests black man moving in.
Into my new apartment.
He's the Chicago police chief. FBI steps in.
Why are you arresting me?
Officer Marcus Stone's radio crackles with routine dispatch calls as his patrol car rolls slowly down Fullerton Avenue. 17 years on the job. He knows this neighborhood the way a hunter knows a forest. Every shadow, every movement, every person who doesn't quite belong. He sees the U-Haul first, parked outside Riverside Apartments. The truck is out of place in this neighborhood. It belongs to people who move themselves, not people who hire movers, not people from here. His eyes narrow. Something about it triggers an old instinct, the kind he's learned never to ignore. Then he sees the man, mid-50s, dark skin, gray at the temples, northwestern hoodie, casual, too casual for this neighborhood. The man is unloading furniture, a leather sectional, moving it with the kind of careful precision that suggests he's done this 100 times before, and he's black in Lincoln Park. Marcus feels something shift in his chest, not fear, not exactly suspicion, just a certainty that has been reinforced over 17 years of policing. A mathematical equation his brain has already solved, does not belong, worth investigating. Marcus pulls over. The man doesn't see him at first. He's focused, talking quietly to himself about angles and leverage, about getting the sectional through the doorway without damaging the walls, absorbed in the task, vulnerable. "Hey." Marcus's voice cuts across the street. His hand is already resting on his belt, fingers steady. "You live here?" The man freezes. He turns slowly, sizing up the officer, the way a boxer sizes up an opponent. And there, in that moment, Marcus sees something unexpected. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Like this man knew this moment was coming. "I'm moving into Unit 2847, the man says calmly, too calmly. "Yes, I live here." Something in that response irritates Marcus. It's the tone, it's the assumption of civility. It's the way the man speaks like this as a normal conversation between equals. "ID," Marcus says. Not a question, a command. "Am I being detained?" the man asks. The question hangs in the air. The exact question someone asks when they've watched their rights online, when they think they understand the law better than the officer standing in front of them, when they're testing you. Marcus's jaw tightens. "Show me your ID now." "Are you detaining me?" the man repeats. His voice is still calm, but there's steel underneath, the tone of someone who won't be pushed around. "Because if I'm not being detained, I'm going to finish moving my furniture." Marcus feels heat flood his face. He has arrested people for less, for this exact kind of disrespect, for this exact kind of challenge to his authority. His hand moves to his belt. His radio is there. His gun is there. His 17 years of assumptions are there. "You're being detained," he says flatly. His voice drops. It's the voice he uses when things are about to get serious. "Now, turn around, hands behind your back." "Officer, I live here," the man says. His calmness is infuriating. "I'm moving into this building. My ID is inside my apartment. I can show you. Turn around now." The man's expression hardens. For the first time, the mask cracks. His jaw clenches. And in that moment, Marcus sees disappointment flash across his face. Not fear, not anger, but the look of someone watching a prediction come true. The man turns. Marcus moves quickly. Years of muscle memory take over. The cuffs click into place with a sound that seems to echo down the entire street. The finality of it. The point of no return. A woman walking her dog 3 buildings down stops and stares. A teenager in an apartment window is filming on his phone. Neither of them knows what they're witnessing yet. Neither of them understands that this moment, this exact moment, is going to change everything. "David Harrison," the man says quietly from the back of the patrol car, not angry, not fighting, just stating facts. 2847 Riverside Apartments. You can call the building. You can verify. Marcus isn't listening. He's already running the ID through the system. The database is slow, always slow. The screen flickers, data loads. Marcus's stomach drops, his hands go cold. There's a moment, one crystalline moment of pure realization, where Marcus understands that everything that happens next could have been prevented. All he has to do is say something. All he has to do is acknowledge what he's reading on the screen. All he has to do is walk back to the patrol car and say, I made a mistake. You're free to go. That moment lasts maybe 3 seconds. Marcus doesn't take it. You're under arrest, he says instead. His voice is flat, professional, like he's reading from a script because his brain is shut down, because what he's seeing on the screen doesn't match what he's done, because the only way to move forward is to keep moving, to pretend the contradiction doesn't exist. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words flow out, standard, automatic, 1,000 arrests, all sounding the same. In the back of the patrol car, David Harrison closes his eyes. He doesn't struggle, doesn't protest, just sits there with the kind of resigned patience that suggests he's thought about this moment, this exact moment many times before. How to survive it, how to stay safe, what not to do. As Marcus pulls away from the curb, as the phone in David Harrison's pocket begins to buzz with incoming calls, as the teenager's TikTok video begins uploading, as the woman with the dog pulls out her own phone to record, nobody yet knows what's about to happen, but it's coming. Within the next 2 hours, everything will change. The superintendent of police will be sitting in a holding cell. Body camera footage will exist, citizen video will start spreading, and a question will begin to reverberate through Chicago. A question that nobody can answer. What have we done? That moment when Marcus saw the database screen, when he could have stopped everything, what would you have done? Would you have admitted the mistake, or would you have kept going like nothing happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This question matters. The police station at the 18th District felt the same way it always did to Marcus, like a place where order was maintained, where chaos was processed into something manageable. The holding area smelled like industrial cleaner, sweat, and the 1,000 small dramas of human suffering that passed through every single day. David Harrison sat in the processing area with his hand still cuffed, waiting. His eyes had opened during the drive, and now they moved methodically around the space, cataloging details. His foot was perfectly still. His breathing was measured. If someone were to observe him without context, they might think he was simply tired. But there was an intentionality to his stillness that suggested something different, that he was choosing how to exist in this moment. Marcus was booking him. The paperwork was almost finished. Suspicious persons in an upscale neighborhood. No identification provided, resisting a lawful order. The charges were thin, but they would stick long enough to matter. They would stick until someone made phone calls. They would stick until someone important got involved. And they would stick long enough for something remarkable to happen. David Harrison, the desk sergeant read, his fingers still moving across the keyboard. 56 years old, Chicago resident. You have any prior... He stopped, his fingers stilled. His eyes moved back to the screen. What? Marcus said. The sergeant's face had changed. There was a very specific expression that happened in police stations when someone important was being booked, when the normal protocols suddenly became inadequate. This was that expression. What? Marcus repeated more urgently. Get Captain Morrison, the sergeant said quietly. Right now. Tell her to get down here. Why? What's going on? The sergeant didn't answer. He was staring at the screen with the kind of expression you get when you realize you've just made a catastrophic mistake and there's no way to unmake it. Captain Patricia Morrison arrived 5 minutes later, still in her dress uniform from a community meeting. She was 53, had been with the department for 31 years, and had spent the last 8 of those fighting for a reputation as someone who actually cared about doing things correctly. She took one look at the screen and her entire body seemed to tense. "Unbook him," she said to the sergeant. Then to Marcus, "Officer Stone, my office, now." The office was small, efficiently organized with commendations on the wall and family photos on the desk. Morrison sat behind her desk, Marcus standing in front of it like a student called to the principal's office. The dynamic was uncomfortable. Marcus was technically senior to her in years of service, but Morrison had the authority here, and they both understood it. "Do you know who you just arrested?" Morrison asked, a suspect matching the description of, "Do you know who David Harrison is?" Marcus didn't answer because the answer was becoming clear. The name on the screen, the addresses in the system, the level of urgency that had rippled through the building, it all pointed toward someone significant. "Chief David Harrison," Morrison said quietly, "was appointed superintendent of the Chicago Police Department 3 months ago. He was confirmed by the city council. He's been featured in the Tribune, on the news, and in every internal communication we've sent out in the last 90 days. You arrested the chief of police." The world didn't exactly stop. It kept moving, kept existing, kept operating according to the same laws of physics and reality, but Marcus's perception of it shifted on its axis. Everything that had just happened suddenly demanded to be understood through an entirely different lens. Marcus started. He didn't identify himself. "He asked if he was being detained," Morrison said. "He gave you his address. He told you who he was. You chose not to listen." This was the thing that made Morrison different from a lot of other supervisors. She didn't minimize what had happened. She didn't try to soften it or suggest that mistakes happen and everyone should move forward. She stated the facts with clinical precision, forcing you to confront what you'd actually done. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "That depends entirely on what Chief Harrison wants to happen," Morrison said. "He's been very clear about his mission since his appointment. Police reform, accountability, racial justice. He's written extensively about implicit bias. He's created new training protocols. He's implemented body camera reviews. And now you've arrested him for being black in an upscale neighborhood." She let that sit for a moment. "The body cameras are on," Morrison continued. "There's citizen footage. He's already called the mayor's office from the holding cell. The commissioner is going to know about this in the next 20 minutes. After that, it spreads beyond our control." "What about the charges?" Marcus asked. "Are you serious right now?" Morrison's voice, when she spoke, was almost quiet, which was somehow worse than if she'd been shouting. "The charges are absolutely not going to stick, Officer Stone. The charges were never going to stick. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences for you, for this department, for Chicago." Meanwhile, downstairs in the holding area, David Harrison was on his phone. The call had been allowed, a courtesy that should have come much earlier, and he was speaking in measured tones to the mayor's chief of staff. "Yes, I'm being held," he said. "Officer Marcus Stone, 18th District. The charges are suspicious persons and resisting. No, I did identify myself multiple times. I offered to have them verify my address with the building management. I asked if I was being detained, and when the officer said I was, I complied with his orders." He paused, listening. "I understand the implications," he said. "Yes, I'm aware this is going to be complicated. No, I don't want any special treatment. I want the process to follow its normal course. I want transparency. I want body camera footage released, and I want us to use this as a teaching moment." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality that suggested he was smiling, though no one observing him would have necessarily seen it. "Because if I can't walk through my own neighborhood without being detained on the basis of racial profiling, if the superintendent of police isn't safe from the exact kind of behavior I've been working to, eliminate, then that tells us something very important about the scope of the problem. And sometimes you have to be willing to let the problem reveal itself, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. At this moment, everything changed for everyone involved. Comment below. Do you think Chief Harrison made the right choice by allowing the arrest to proceed? Would you have immediately revealed who you were, or would you have wanted to see how the system treated you? The afternoon after the arrest, the FBI's Civil Rights Division received a formal complaint. It came through official channels filed by Chief David Harrison himself, requesting a full investigation into Officer Marcus Stone's conduct and the patterns of behavior within the 18th District. What the FBI found when they began pulling records was a narrative that had been hiding in plain sight. Officer Marcus Stone had been with the Chicago Police Department for 17 years. In those 17 years, he had conducted 247 traffic stops in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Of those stops, 189 involved black drivers. The statistical probability of that distribution occurring naturally was infinitesimal. It required a deliberate pattern of behavior. But the traffic stops were just the beginning. The Internal Affairs database, once accessed by investigators, revealed a more comprehensive picture. There were 47 complaints on file against Officer Stone. 47 allegations that ranged from aggressive behavior to false arrest to racial profiling. Most had been filed between 2015 and 2023, a concentrated period when Stone was at his most active in the Lincoln Park area. Of those 47 complaints, exactly 0 had resulted in disciplinary action. This wasn't because the complaints were unfounded. Many of them had been substantiated by supervisors. Body camera footage existed. Witness statements had been collected. But the cases had been processed through a system that seemed designed specifically to absorb complaints without producing consequences. They had been filed, cataloged, and archived in a way that technically created a record while practically ensuring nothing would happen. Officer Stone wasn't unique. The record showed a department-wide pattern. Supervisors were reluctant to discipline their own. The Internal Affairs Division was understaffed and underfunded. Cases took years to process. By the time action might have been considered, attention had moved on to other scandals, other crises, other incidents, demanding immediate response. Chief Harrison had seen these patterns from the moment he arrived. He'd inherited a police department that functioned, on the surface, like a professional law enforcement agency. Below the surface, it operated like a closed system designed primarily to protect its members from accountability. The statistics he'd reviewed during his hiring process had been sanitized. The real numbers, the ones that showed officers like Marcus Stone operating with near total impunity, had been in the database all along, waiting for someone to actually look at them. Now someone was looking. Special Agent Keisha Williams was the lead investigator on the case. She was in her 40s, had worked civil rights cases for 8 years, and had developed a particular skill for finding patterns in bureaucratic systems. She sat across from Chief Harrison in a secure room at the FBI's Chicago field office, a digital file between them containing 47 complaints and the corresponding disciplinary records, or lack thereof. "This is systemic," Williams said. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion, stated as fact. "Yes," Chief Harrison agreed. "And you knew this when you took the position." "Not all of it. Not to this extent, but I had suspicions. I had the patterns the department wanted me to see, and I had access to the information that suggested there were other patterns underneath those. I was trying to reform from within. Then this happened, and suddenly I had external pressure to act." Williams leaned back in her chair. "Tell me about the choice you made. Why did you let Officer Stone arrest you? Why didn't you identify yourself immediately?" Chief Harrison took a moment before answering. When he did, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd asked himself this question many times. "Because if I had identified myself, the situation would have ended differently. Officer Stone would have realized who I was, would have become apologetic, would have let me go, and nothing would have changed. The complaint would have been dismissed, or it would have been filed and processed through the same system that's processed 47 other complaints from black men who don't happen to be police superintendents. He paused. I wanted to experience what an ordinary person experiences in this situation, not because I wanted to be a martyr or prove a point, though maybe on some level. I did want to prove a point, but because the only way to genuinely understand a system is to move through it the way other people do, I needed to see what it felt like to be detained on the basis of your appearance in a neighborhood where you live. I needed to experience the moment where your words don't matter, because the officer has already decided who you are. By evening, the story had reached the media, not as a rumor, but as a confirmed report from multiple sources. Officer arrests Chicago police chief superintendent detained during move-in. The headlines proliferated across news organizations, each finding their own angle. The department held a press conference. Captain Morrison stood at a podium, her face tight, her words carefully chosen. The Chicago Police Department takes all allegations of misconduct seriously, she said. We are cooperating fully with the FBI's investigation. Officer Marcus Stone has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. We are committed to accountability and to restoring public trust in our department. The cameras flashed. The questions came rapid fire. Was Chief Harrison safe? Had there been other incidents? What would happen to Officer Stone? Morrison answered what she could answer. She defended neither the officer nor the system. She simply stated facts and acknowledged that an investigation was underway. That night, Officer Marcus Stone sat in his apartment and watched the news. He saw his name, his face, his actions being dissected by journalists and commentators. He saw the 47 complaints detailed in news reports. He saw people on social media, people he'd never met, offering their opinions about who he was and what he deserved. What he didn't see, not yet, was where this was going. What he couldn't yet understand was that this was only the beginning. The investigation into Officer Stone's history revealed patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. Comment: should police officers with multiple complaints be automatically suspended pending investigation? What kind of accountability system would actually work? David Harrison's appointment as superintendent had been unusual because his entire career had been unusual. He wasn't a cop who had risen through the traditional ranks. He was a cop who had refused to rise through traditional ranks and who had spent 3 decades challenging the system from within and without. He had started in patrol in 1992 after earning his degree in criminal justice from Northwestern University. In those early years, he'd been a good cop, the kind who followed orders, who did his job, who didn't ask questions that might complicate things. But something had shifted in the late 1990s when he was assigned to work with a community task force in the Southside neighborhood of Englewood. Englewood was a neighborhood where police-community relations had deteriorated to almost nothing. There was fear on both sides. Residents feared police. Police feared residents. The task force's mandate was to improve that relationship. What it actually did was give Harrison a chance to see something he'd been trained not to see, that the system he was part of was actively harming the people it claimed to protect. He'd spent 5 years in Englewood, 5 years of community meetings, 5 years of trying to understand root causes of crime beyond bad people doing bad things, 5 years of watching young men he'd arrested at 20 get arrested again at 25, having learned nothing but how to navigate the prison system more effectively. By 2003, Harrison had made a decision. He was going to fix policing or he was going to leave it. Those were his only options. He got his master's degree in public administration. He started writing. He gave interviews to academic researchers. He testified before city council about racial disparities in arrest patterns. He became essentially a cop who was loudly criticizing the police department, which was a career move that traditional wisdom suggested would end very poorly. Except it didn't, because Harrison was careful, he was rigorous, he had the data to back up everything he said, and he was already a lieutenant by then, which meant he had enough institutional standing that firing him would have created more problems than it solved. By 2010, he'd published his first book, Bias by Design: How American Police Departments Institutionalize Racial Inequality. It became required reading in progressive law enforcement circles. It was cited in congressional testimony. It was taught in universities. By 2020, after a summer of protests and a national reckoning with police violence, Chicago's mayor had looked at her options. She could hire a superintendent who represented the old guard, who would protect the department's institutional interests and resist change. Or she could hire someone who represented something different. She'd chosen David Harrison. His confirmation had been contentious. Police union representatives testified against him. Conservative politicians suggested he was an activist disguised as a cop. But the tide of public opinion in that particular historical moment was flowing in a different direction. Harrison had been confirmed with a 42-9 vote. For 3 months, he had been superintendent. In that time, he'd implemented mandatory quarterly reviews of body camera footage for every officer, created a civilian oversight board with real investigative authority, established an early warning system to flag officers with patterns of complaints, revised the racial profiling manual to include specific guidance on implicit bias, begun a comprehensive audit of all open internal affairs cases, created a new protocol requiring officers to document the reason for every traffic stop and pedestrian encounter. He'd also made enemies. The Fraternal Order of Police had called for his resignation. Some of his own supervisors had quietly expressed the belief that he was soft on officers and was undermining departmental morale. Then he'd been arrested by one of his own officers, and suddenly everything had become clear. The body camera footage from Officer Stone's interaction with Chief Harrison was released by the FBI on the evening of the second day. It was released not to the media, but as part of the official investigation record, which meant someone in the department leaked it to the media within hours. The video showed everything. The moment Marcus Stone pulled over, the initial approach, the question, "Am I being detained?" followed by Stone's answer that yes, the man was being detained. The moment where Stone asked for ID, Harrison offering his address, Stone demanding the man turn around. And then something that the news reports hadn't quite captured, Harrison's face, the moment where his expression shifted, not into fear, not into anger, but into something else, something like acknowledgement, like he was watching a prediction come true, and while he'd known it was going to happen, the actual moment of it happening still required him to feel it. The handcuffs clicked into place. In the background of the video, you could hear the woman with the dog asking Stone what was happening. You could hear the distant sound of the teenager filming from the apartment window. The video was 11 minutes long. Most of it was Stone and Harrison in the patrol car, not talking, just existing in that confined space with the reality of what had happened between them. When they got to the station, the video cut to the moment where the sergeant looked at the screen and understood what had been done. The internet reacted, Twitter erupted, Facebook was ablaze with argument. News organizations ran the video on loop, analyzing every frame, every moment, every small gesture. Some people focused on Harrison's composure. Others focused on Stone's lack of awareness. Some suggested that Harrison had orchestrated the whole thing to make a point. Others suggested that Stone was a victim of entrapment, that Harrison had deliberately allowed himself to be arrested to damage Stone's career and the department's reputation. The narrative fractured into 1,000 different interpretations, none of them completely wrong, all of them missing the larger point. That a system designed to protect people had arrested the person meant to be protecting them, and no one had found that remarkable enough to stop it before it happened. Chief Harrison gave an interview 3 days after the video was released. He sat across from a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, and his words were careful but direct. What happened to me is not unique. What is unique is that I have a platform to talk about it. I have resources. I have credibility. I have the ability to fight back. An ordinary person in this situation doesn't have those advantages. They might spend days in custody. They might lose their job. They might face charges that take months to resolve. They might be traumatized by an experience that was entirely predicated on assumptions about who they were based on what they look like and where they were standing. He paused. I want to be very clear about something. I did not want this to happen. I would have preferred to implement police reform through policy and training and a complete restructuring of how this department approaches accountability. I would have preferred to never experience what I experienced. But now that it's happened, I'm determined to use it. Not for my benefit. Honestly, the attention on me right now makes it harder to do the work. But for the benefit of everyone who has ever been wrongfully detained, everyone who has ever been arrested on the basis of assumptions, everyone who has been failed by a system that should have protected them. Chief Harrison's entire career had been building toward confronting the system he was part of. Juxiki, in the comments, do you think his appointment as superintendent was meant to change the system from within, or do you think this incident revealed the limits of reform from inside a broken institution? The FBI's investigation into Officer Marcus Stone's conduct accelerated dramatically once the body camera footage was released. What had started as a complaint investigation into a single incident suddenly became a comprehensive review of the entire 18th District's patterns of behavior. Special Agent Keisha Williams expanded her team. She brought in 3 additional investigators, one of whom specialized in statistical analysis of law enforcement data. They set up a temporary office at the FBI field office in Chicago and began the methodical work of building a case that would be bulletproof. The statistics they found were devastating. Officer Stone had conducted 247 documented stops in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Over 17 years of those stops, 189 involved black drivers or pedestrians. The remaining 58 involved people of other races. In the Chicago population overall, black residents made up approximately 30% of the city, but in Officer Stone's stops in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood, they made up 77%. The methodology was simple, but powerful. If Stone's behavior had been race neutral, the numbers should have roughly reflected the population. They didn't. The numbers reflected a clear pattern of targeting. But the traffic stops were only the beginning. Once investigators started pulling complaint records in detail, they found a far more comprehensive pattern of behavior. In 2016, a young black man named Marcus Williams had reported being stopped by Stone while walking home from his girlfriend's apartment in Lincoln Park. Williams said Stone had detained him for 40 minutes, demanded ID, and then released him without explanation or apology. No complaint had been filed at the time. Williams was young, was intimidated, wasn't sure if he had grounds to complain. But when the FBI reached out to him as part of their investigation, he provided detailed recollection of the incident. In 2018, a black woman named Tasha Mitchell reported being followed by Stone as she walked through the neighborhood at 9 p.m. She said she'd watched him slowly drive alongside her, observed her in his rearview mirror, and eventually pulled over as she approached her apartment building. He'd asked if she lived in the neighborhood. When she said she did, he'd asked for her ID. She'd refused. He'd threatened to detain her. She'd shown him her ID, and he'd left, but not before making a comment about the neighborhood needing to watch out for its security. In 2019, a man named James Chen had been walking in Lincoln Park when Stone stopped him. Chen was Asian American, but Stone had assumed he was in the neighborhood attempting to commit a burglary. The stop lasted 30 minutes. Stone had run his ID and found nothing, but had spent the time suggesting that Chen must be there for a reason, perhaps visiting a friend. perhaps scoping out potential targets. In 2021, a black teenager named Isaiah Foster had been stopped by Stone while standing outside a convenience store waiting for his mother to pick him up. Foster said Stone had approached aggressively, demanding to know what he was doing. When Foster said he was waiting for his mother, Stone had asked where she worked and had suggested that she might not want her son standing outside a store in this neighborhood at this time of day. The implication was clear. A black teenager in an upscale neighborhood was inherently suspicious. These were just the ones people reported. How many people had Stone stopped without generating a complaint? How many interactions had happened without the person feeling confident enough to file a report? How many had happened because they were afraid that reporting would make things worse? Williams brought her findings to Chief Harrison's office on a Thursday morning. She had 2 thick folders, one containing raw data, the other containing narrative statements from victims. She set them on his desk and watched his face as he absorbed what they represented. "We're recommending criminal charges," Williams said. "Violating the civil rights of persons under color of law, it's a federal crime. The evidence is sufficient to prosecute." Chief Harrison opened one of the folders and began reading. His expression didn't change as he moved through the documents, but something in his body language shifted. And this wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't about systems and patterns. This was about people, individual people whose lives had been affected by Officer Stone's behavior. "What does the department say?" Harrison asked. "We haven't involved them yet," Williams said. "This is still an investigation phase. Once we move toward charges, we'll need the department's cooperation for certain records, but that's still weeks away." Harrison closed the folder and looked up at Williams. "I want all of this released. I want the public to know what we found." Williams's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not standard procedure." "I don't care about standard procedure," Harrison said. "The standard procedure is what protected this behavior in the first place. The standard procedure is what allowed an officer to target black residents of this city for 17 years without meaningful consequences. I want transparency. I want accountability, and I want the public to understand that this isn't just about Marcus Stone. This is systemic." Well, the FBI released a preliminary report 48 hours later. It was labeled Investigation into Alleged Civil Rights Violations by Officer Marcus Stone, Chicago Police Department, 18th District. The report detailed 247 documented stops over 17 years, 77% of stops involving black individuals in a neighborhood that is 30% black, 47 formal complaints filed against Officer Stone, with 0 disciplinary actions taken, multiple patterns of racial profiling consistent with violations of Civil Rights Act, Title 42, Section 1983, systemic failure by the department's Internal Affairs Division to investigate and discipline, recommendations for criminal charges, disciplinary action, comprehensive review of the 18th District's practices, mandatory implicit bias training for all department personnel, and restructuring of the internal affairs process. The release of the report coincided with a press conference held by Chief Harrison. He stood at a podium in the Chicago Police Department's headquarters, flanked by the mayor and a civilian representative from the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board. "Today, I'm announcing that the Chicago Police Department is cooperating fully with the FBI's investigation," Harrison said. "Officer Marcus Stone has been placed on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of that investigation. Additionally, I'm initiating a comprehensive review of all personnel in the 18th District and all open internal affairs cases from the past 10 years. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But I want to be very clear about something important. This is not about an individual officer's bad behavior. This is about systems that enabled that behavior, protected that behavior, and failed to hold people accountable for that behavior. This is about a department that made promises to the city and failed to deliver on those promises. And this is about a fundamental failure of leadership, my leadership included, to take these issues seriously enough, quickly enough, urgently enough. The mayor leaned toward the microphone. We are also announcing the creation of a task force to review all cases where Officer Stone was involved. If charges were filed based on his testimony or involvement, those cases will be reviewed to determine if they should be dismissed or retried. Any individuals convicted based on evidence he provided will have access to post-conviction relief. This was significant. This meant potentially dozens of cases could be reopened. People who had pled guilty or been convicted might have grounds to challenge those convictions. The ripple effects were going to spread far beyond Officer Stone's career. That evening, Marcus Stone sat in his apartment and watched the news. He saw the press conference. He saw the statistics. He saw himself being described as someone who had systematically violated the civil rights of citizens and had been part of a systemic pattern of racial discrimination. He had a lawyer now, a decent one, expensive, paid for with savings and a loan from his brother. The lawyer had advised him not to speak publicly, not to respond to allegations, not to engage with the narrative being created around him. The lawyer said the best thing he could do was wait and see how the investigation developed. But waiting was agony because Marcus was beginning to understand what was happening. He was beginning to see his own behavior through a lens he'd carefully avoided using before. He was beginning to recognize that the patterns being described, the 77%, the complaints, the years of behavior, those weren't mistakes. Those were choices. Choices he'd made again and again, choices that had been reinforced by a system that never punished him for making them. He told himself he was doing his job. He told himself he had good instincts. He told himself that black men in Lincoln Park probably didn't belong there, or if they did, they deserved extra scrutiny just to be safe. Now those rationalizations didn't seem to hold up. Now they seemed like the excuses of someone who had known better and had chosen not to do better. The FBI's investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that had been protected by systemic failures. Comment: at what point should an officer with multiple complaints be removed from duty? Should there be a national database tracking officers with patterns of misconduct? By the end of the first week, the story had transcended Chicago. National news outlets were running feature stories about the incident. CNN had a segment called Policing While Black, the story of Chief David Harrison. MSNBC ran a special report on racial profiling in American police departments using Chicago's 18th district as a case study. The social media reaction was intense and fractured. Some people praised Chief Harrison for his willingness to experience the system that ordinary citizens faced. Justice for Harrison began trending. Activists organized rallies outside Chicago Police Department headquarters, demanding Officer Stone's arrest and prosecution. But there was another side to the narrative, one that grew louder as the days progressed. Police unions issued statements defending their members. Conservative media outlets began suggesting that Chief Harrison had orchestrated the entire incident as a political stunt. Twitter threads appeared, Twitter suggesting that the arrest was justified and that Stone was being scapegoated by a superintendent who was using the incident to consolidate power. A particularly vocal segment of the internet began digging into Chief Harrison's past, looking for anything that could be used to discredit him. They found a speeding ticket from 2003. They found a divorce that had ended badly. They found a lawsuit filed against him by a neighbor over a property line. These were the ordinary complications of human existence, but they were weaponized, deployed as evidence that Harrison was not the reformer he claimed to be, but simply another ambitious politician using social justice as a ladder to power. The Chicago Tribune ran a piece questioning whether Stone had been denied due process. The Fraternal Order of Police released a statement suggesting that the rush to judgment was undermining the morale of the entire department and endangering police officers citywide. Conservative politicians called for Chief Harrison's resignation. By the 10th day, the narrative had expanded beyond Officer Stone to include broader questions about police funding, police power, and whether society was overreacting to a single incident. News outlets that had initially presented the story as a clear-cut case of racial profiling began presenting it as complicated, presenting multiple perspectives, giving voice to people who believed Stone was a victim of circumstances and an overzealous administration. This was the moment when Chief Harrison made a decision that would crystallize the issue beyond any possibility of nuance. He held a press conference at the site where his arrest had occurred, outside the Riverside Apartments in Lincoln Park. He stood on the exact spot where he'd been handcuffed, in the same clothes he'd been wearing, with body camera footage playing on screens behind him. "I'm going to be direct about something," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the city. "This story has become about me. That was not my intention, but I understand why it happened. I'm a public figure. My arrest was unusual. It's natural that attention would focus on me." He paused. "But this story should not be about me. It should be about the people who don't have a platform to talk about their experiences. It should be about Marcus Williams, who was stopped and detained in this neighborhood for 40 minutes in 2016 for the crime of walking home. It should be about Tasha Mitchell, who was followed like a predator in her own neighborhood. It should be about Isaiah Foster, who was told implicitly that his presence in an upscale neighborhood made him suspicious. It should be about the families in the 18th District who have spent years being policed based on assumptions about who they are and what they're capable of." The camera panned across the assembled media, then back to Harrison. "I'm also going to address the people who believe that Officer Stone is a victim here. I understand that perspective. I do. Officer Stone is losing his job. He's being prosecuted. His reputation is destroyed. That's genuinely difficult, and I'm not minimizing that difficulty. But Officer Stone's experience right now, the public scrutiny, the loss of employment, the feeling that the system is stacked against him, that's what black men in this city have been experiencing for decades. That's what the people I just mentioned have been experiencing. That's the cumulative effect of a system that profiles people based on race. He let that land. So I'm not going to apologize for the investigation. I'm not going to suggest that we should go easier on Officer Stone because he's having a hard time. What I'm going to do is use his situation to illuminate something that's been happening in the shadows for years. I'm going to use this moment to say, if the superintendent of police isn't safe from profiling in his own neighborhood, what does that tell us about how ordinary people are treated? That quote, "If the superintendent of police isn't safe from profiling, what does that tell us about how ordinary people are treated?" became the defining statement of the scandal. It was the moment where the narrative shifted from unusual incident involving prominent person to systemic indictment of policing practices. National organizations began getting involved. The ACLU filed a Freedom of Information request for all police reports involving Officer Stone. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened an investigation. Legal scholars from Harvard, Yale, and University of Chicago began publishing opinion pieces about what the case revealed about American policing. But the media firestorm also had a personal cost. Officer Marcus Stone's family was harassed. His address was doxxed. Someone threw a brick through his apartment window with a note attached that said, "Murderer." Other people created websites defending him, which attracted the kind of people who showed up on his doorstep with signs. His wife filed for divorce, not because of his behavior toward her, but because she couldn't handle the public attention. She gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune where she said he became a different person when all of this started, not because of what he did. I think he always had these patterns, but because suddenly he had to confront who he actually was instead of the person he told himself he was. Stone moved out of his apartment. He moved to the South Side, to a neighborhood where he wouldn't be recognized. He got a lawyer who advised him to plead guilty to as many charges as possible, to express remorse, to hope that the justice system would be merciful to someone who was cooperating and taking responsibility. But the justice system, once it started rolling, was difficult to redirect, and the charges came down on a Wednesday morning. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced that Officer Marcus Stone was being charged with 2 counts of violating civil rights under Title 42, Section 1983, false imprisonment, deprivation of liberty, pattern and practice of discrimination. The charges carried sentences up to 10 years per count. Collectively, Stone was looking at decades of federal imprisonment. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal. Stone would plead guilty to 2 of the charges, would accept full responsibility for his actions, and would cooperate with ongoing investigations into the department. In return, the prosecutors would recommend a sentence of 5 years with the possibility of parole after 2. Stone accepted the deal. At his sentencing hearing, he made a statement to the court. His voice was quiet, his words careful. Your Honor, I want to apologize to the people I wronged. I want to apologize to David Harrison, whose arrest was completely unjustified. I want to apologize to every person I stopped based on their race. I want to apologize to the community I was supposed to serve, but instead harmed. He paused, struggling with emotion. I keep thinking about the moment when I decided to pull Chief Harrison over. I keep thinking about the choices I made in that moment. And I realize now that those weren't instincts. Those were assumptions. Those were biases. And I chose not to examine them. I chose to let them guide my behavior. And in doing that, I violated people's rights and broke people's trust. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had been on the bench for 20 years, listened impassively. I don't expect forgiveness, Stone continued. I don't expect my apology to undo the harm I caused. I just want people to understand that I understand what I did now. I understand that my actions were part of a larger system that oppresses people based on their race. And I take full responsibility for my role in that system. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 30 months. The sentence was less severe than it might have been, but it was. Also not a slap on the wrist. It was significant. It was meant to send a message. What you did matters. It had consequences. It will not be ignored. Officer Stone's sentencing revealed the human cost of the scandal on all sides. The victim, the perpetrator, the system, everyone involved. Comment: do you think Stone's punishment was proportionate? What should police accountability actually look like? The story didn't end with Officer Stone's sentencing. In many ways, that was when the real systemic change began. The FBI's investigation into the 18th District expanded into a full civil rights review of the entire Chicago Police Department. Investigators pulled data going back 15 years. They identified other officers with suspicious patterns of stops and arrests. They found that Officer Stone was not unique. He was simply the most egregious example of a pattern that existed throughout the department. Within 3 months of the initial arrest, the FBI had identified 12 officers with patterns of racial profiling similar to Stone's. Not as extreme, but clearly evidence of the same behavioral patterns. 3 of those officers resigned before facing charges. 6 more were placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. 3 were charged with violations of civil rights. The media attention on these other cases was significantly less than it had been for Officer Stone. There was something about the initial incident, the shock of it, the prominence of David Harrison, the clarity of the wrongdoing that had captured public imagination in a way that subsequent charges couldn't replicate. But within law enforcement and civil rights circles, the expanding investigation was significant. Chief Harrison, meanwhile, was dealing with a different kind of pressure. The very people who had criticized him for taking the system on were now criticizing him for not taking it on hard enough. Activists demanded that he fire every officer with a complaint. Civil rights groups demanded that he overhaul the entire department. The mayor's office, sensing that the political tide had shifted, started asking why more officers weren't being charged, why more bad actors weren't being removed from the streets. Harrison found himself in a difficult position. He believed in genuine reform, in systems change, in training, in structural adjustment. But the political moment was demanding something more dramatic. It was demanding visible punishment. It was demanding that bad officers be removed and that the public see those removals happen. He walked a difficult line. He pushed the FBI to prosecute aggressively. He demanded that every officer with substantiated complaints face disciplinary action. He created a new early warning system designed to flag problematic behavior before it became patterns, but he also resisted the impulse to scapegoat officers or to suggest that removing a few bad people would fix a fundamentally broken system. The problem isn't individuals, he said in an interview with The Atlantic. The problem is that we've designed a system that makes profiling easy and accountability impossible. You can change the individuals and still have the same problem. What we need to do is change the system, but changing the system required resources, political will, and a sustained commitment that might outlast the current moment of attention. Those were harder to guarantee. 6 months into the investigation, the city's inspector general released a comprehensive report on the Chicago Police Department's handling of complaints. The report found that only 3% of complaints against officers resulted in disciplinary action. The average time from complaint to resolution was 3 years. Many complaints were marked as unsubstantiated, despite existing body camera footage that supported them. The department had no mechanism for identifying patterns of complaints against individual officers. Supervisors were actively discouraged from disciplining their subordinates. The report recommended immediate suspension of any officer with 3 or more substantiated complaints within a 5-year period, public disclosure of all complaints and their outcomes, complete restructuring of the Internal Affairs Division, mandatory civilian participation in disciplinary hearings, creation of a police review board with the power to subpoena and compel testimony. Implementation of these recommendations would have required significant departmental restructuring. It would have required changing the culture of protection that had developed over decades. It would have required officers to understand that their department was no longer going to defend them in situations where they'd violated people's rights. The Fraternal Order of Police fought back hard. They filed lawsuits. They filed grievances. They held a press conference where their representative, a man named James Murphy, made an impassioned statement. We are not saying that Officer Stone's behavior was acceptable. We are saying that this rush to judgment, this assumption that officers are guilty until proven innocent, this undermining of the morale and authority of the men and women who keep the city safe, this is not justice. This is revenge. The quote was repeated in every conservative media outlet. It became the rallying cry for a backlash against police reform. Right-wing political groups organized rallies in support of police. Billboards began appearing around Chicago with messages like, "Back the Blue" and "Support our heroes." Chief Harrison found himself increasingly politically isolated. The mayor, initially supportive, began distancing herself from the more aggressive reform proposals. She suggested in an interview that maybe the department was moving too fast, that maybe they needed to make sure reforms didn't go too far in the other direction. Inside the department, morale was plummeting. Good officers who had been trying to do the right thing, felt demonized by association. Some started considering retirement, others started networking with other departments in other cities. There was a real possibility that the department could lose institutional knowledge and professional expertise as the fallout spread. By month 9, the investigation had resulted in 12 officers charged with civil rights violations, 3 officers fired, 8 officers who resigned, 23 officers suspended pending investigation, 47 complaints reviewed and substantiated, resulting in disciplinary action. Multiple lawsuits filed by both civilians against the department and the Fraternal Order of Police against the city. The financial cost was significant. The city was facing potential settlements in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The police budget was being strained by legal costs. The overall impact on the city's finances was becoming noticeable, which meant the political pressure was increasing at every level. Our tainted surprise, Officer Marcus Stone's story, meanwhile, had followed a different trajectory. He reported to prison in a federal facility outside Indianapolis. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner. He participated in educational programs. He worked in the prison kitchen. He wrote letters of apology to people he'd wronged, letters that he wasn't sure would ever be delivered or read. He kept a journal, which was eventually obtained by a journalist writing a book about the scandal. In his entries, Stone reflected on his behavior, on the system that had enabled it, on the moment when he'd arrested David Harrison. I think about that day constantly. I think about what would have happened if I just listened when he told me who he was. I think about the moment where I could have made a different choice and didn't. I chose to escalate. I chose to disbelieve him. I chose to assume he was lying based on his appearance. And in doing that, I set off a chain of events that destroyed multiple lives, including my own. What's strange is that I don't feel like I did anything that was very different from what I'd been doing for 17 years. I stopped people based on how they looked. I profiled them. I made assumptions about who they were and what they were doing. The only difference with Chief Harrison was that he had the power to do something about it. He had the platform to expose what happened. I wonder sometimes if I would have ended up here if he'd identified himself immediately. I wonder if I would have spent another 5 or 10 years doing exactly the same thing, stopping black men, making assumptions, building a record of behavior that would eventually catch up with me anyway. Or would I have gone my whole career without facing consequences? Would I have retired with a pension and a sense that I'd done my job well? I'll never know the answer to that. What I do know is that I'm here now, and I'm beginning to understand what I did. The fallout from a single arrest spread through an entire system, affecting hundreds of people and fundamentally changing how a major American city approached police accountability. Comment: when institutions fail, who bears the real cost? The officers, the victims, the public, or everyone collectively? By the end of year 1, Chicago had undergone the most significant police reform in its modern history. Chief David Harrison had worked with the city council to pass a comprehensive package of reforms that included structural changes, creation of an independent police, accountability board with power to subpoena, investigate, and recommend discipline, establishment of a civilian police oversight commission with voting power on departmental policies, restructuring of the Internal Affairs Division under civilian leadership, implementation of a misconduct tracking database, accessible to the public, mandatory rotation of officers out of assignments every 5 years to prevent patterns of behavior policy changes, elimination of the broken windows, policing approach in favor of community-based prevention, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, with annual recertification, required creation of a race-based disparity monitoring system that would flag patterns in real-time requirement, that every traffic stop, pedestrian encounter, and arrest include documentation of the specific reason body camera footage review on a monthly basis for every officer use of force, reporting requirements that include full detail and justification. Personnel changes. Any officer with 3 substantiated complaints within a 5-year period automatically suspended pending review, public notification of all substantiated complaints. Prohibition on settlement agreements that require victims to sign non-disclosure clauses. Creation of a civilian review process for disciplinary decisions. Mandatory reporting of all complaints to the state's law enforcement. Licensing board. Community engagement. Monthly community meetings between precinct commanders and neighborhood associations. Police accountability forums where community members could voice concerns, partnership with local organizations to address root causes of crime, diversion programs for low-level offenses, mental health response teams, for calls involving people with psychiatric conditions. The reforms were comprehensive, ambitious, and expensive. They required redirecting police funds toward accountability infrastructure. They required training and retraining. They required a fundamental shift in departmental culture. The impact was measurable almost immediately. Within 3 months, civilian complaints against police increased. This was initially presented as a bad sign by police union representatives. More complaints meant more problems, they argued. But the reality was more complex. Complaints increased because people suddenly believed that complaints might actually matter. They believed that filing a complaint might result in some form of accountability. For years, complaints had gone nowhere, which meant people had stopped filing them. Now people were filing complaints again because they sensed that something had changed. Secondly, complaints increased because the department was actually looking for problems. The new early warning system was designed specifically to identify patterns of behavior, which meant officers who previously might have gone undetected were now being flagged. By the end of year 1, an additional 8 officers had been terminated or resigned as a result of the early warning system identifying problematic patterns. These weren't high-profile cases like Officer Stone's. They were quiet removals of officers whose behavior patterns had been identified through data analysis rather than dramatic incidents. The most significant change, however, was cultural. Police officers in Chicago, both the good ones and the problematic ones, suddenly understood that their behavior was being monitored. They understood that patterns would be identified. They understood that the department might finally start holding them accountable. Some officers adapted. They changed their behavior. They stopped the kinds of profiling and targeting that had characterized their work before. They began focusing on actual crimes rather than suspicious people. Other officers left. The police union reported a spike in resignations in the months following the reforms. Officers cited low morale, lack of respect, and the sense that they were being treated as criminals for doing their jobs. Some of those officers went to other departments in other cities. Others left policing entirely. The department's hiring accelerated to replace departing officers. New recruits were trained on the reform system from day one. They didn't have years of institutional memory suggesting that profiling was acceptable or that accountability was something that would never actually happen to them. They had a different understanding of what being a police officer meant. Crime statistics were complicated. Violent crime initially increased slightly in the months following the most aggressive reforms, which the police union pointed to as evidence that reform had gone too far. But by the end of year 2, violent crime had returned to previous levels and continued a long-term decline. Property crime decreased. The evidence suggested that the reforms had not made Chicago less safe. They had made it differently safe. They had shifted the police department from being a reactive force that targeted specific populations to being a preventive force that engaged with communities in different ways. Biden, Chief Harrison gave a final press conference on the 1-year anniversary of his arrest. He stood in the same location again, in front of the Riverside Apartments, with the city skyline behind him. This time, the assembled media was smaller than it had been during the scandal. The moment had passed. Other crises had emerged to capture public attention, but the people who cared about policing and accountability were there, and they listened intently to what Harrison had to say. "A year ago, I was arrested here," he said. "An officer made assumptions about who I was based on what I look like. He detained me. He arrested me. He violated my rights. That incident was the shock that forced this city to confront something it had been avoiding, that our police department was not operating the way we believed it was operating." He paused. "I want to be very clear. The work we've done over the past year is necessary, but it's also incomplete. We've changed policies. We've changed structures. We've identified and removed officers who were engaging in patterns of misconduct. But changing a system takes time. Changing a culture takes longer. There are still officers who believe that profiling is justified. There are still supervisors who protect their subordinates rather than holding them accountable. There are still gaps in the system where problems can hide." He looked directly at the camera. "But something has changed. The idea that police accountability might actually happen, that idea is no longer theoretical. It's real. It's happening. And that changes everything. Because accountability requires the possibility of consequence. When there's no consequence, there's no incentive to change behavior. When there's consequence, everything shifts." Year and a half into the reforms, David Harrison announced he was stepping down as superintendent. He gave a carefully crafted statement explaining that the hard work of reform had been done and that the department needed new leadership to take it to the next phase. He was moving into a new role as a national consultant on police reform, working with other cities facing similar crises. His departure was bittersweet. He had accomplished something genuinely significant. He had broken a closed system and forced it to confront its own failures. But he had also experienced the isolation and resistance that came with that accomplishment. The job had been harder than he'd anticipated. The resistance had been more organized and more vicious than he'd expected. And perhaps most importantly, he had come to believe that someone else could push the reforms forward more effectively than he could. Officer Marcus Stone had served 2 years of his 5-year sentence when he was granted parole. He walked out of federal prison in early 2028, 2 years after his arrest of Chief Harrison, 2 years after everything changed. He found a world that had moved on. The scandal had faded from major news. Other incidents, other crises, other national emergencies had captured public attention. But in Chicago, in the 18th district, something had shifted. Stone could feel it immediately. The way people looked at police officers had changed. The relationship between police and community had shifted, and his place in that landscape was unambiguously clear. He was the officer who he had arrested the police chief while engaging in racial profiling, and he would be remembered as such forever. He moved to Milwaukee. He took a job in a warehouse. He lived quietly and kept to himself. He attended required parole meetings and followed the conditions of his release. He volunteered at a community center, helping young people who were at risk of becoming involved with the criminal justice system. He never spoke publicly about his experience. He never gave interviews or wrote op-eds. But people in Milwaukee eventually recognized him, eventually understood his history, and occasionally asked him what it was like to be the officer at the center of the police reform movement that changed Chicago. His answer was always the same. "I did something that violated people's rights. I went to prison for it. I'm trying to spend the rest of my life making sure other people don't make the same mistakes I made." 10 years after the arrest, a documentary film about the incident was released. It was called The Chief: How One Arrest Changed Policing in Chicago. It featured interviews with David Harrison, now retired and working as a professor. It featured community members who had been stopped and detained by Officer Stone. It featured police officers trying to navigate the reformed system. It featured the mayor, the city council members, the FBI investigators, all of them reflecting on what had happened and what it meant. The film was nominated for a documentary award at Sundance. It played in film festivals around the country. It was used in police training academies to illustrate what systemic racism looks like in practice. It became a teaching tool, a reference point, a moment in time when one city confronted its own failures and chose to try to do better. Looking back from a decade later, the reforms that seemed so dramatic in the moment had become normalized. The Police Accountability Board was no longer controversial. It was simply part of how Chicago did things. The misconduct tracking database that had seemed like an invasion of police privacy was now considered standard practice. The early warning systems that had been attacked as dangerous were now recognized as basic risk management. Other cities had begun implementing similar reforms. The model that Chicago had developed was being studied and adapted in Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta. The conversation about policing was shifting. The question was no longer whether police departments should be accountable. It was how that accountability should be structured to be most effective. This is a story about one moment, one arrest, one confrontation that exposed systemic problems and forced a city to reckon with them. But it's also a story about all of us, about the systems we live in, the assumptions we make, the power dynamics we participate in, without even realizing it. The question, Chief Harrison asked, if the superintendent of police isn't safe from profiling, what does that tell us about how ordinary people are treated? Is still a vital question today. What are your thoughts on police accountability? Do you believe systemic change is possible? What would a truly just policing system look like? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to stay updated on stories about justice, accountability, and the systems that shape our lives. And if this story resonated with you, please share it with others. These conversations matter. They change things. Thank you for watching.